Brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
Okay, we are on episode, believe it or not, 51. Now, a couple disclaimers. First of all, I know that I did not cover nearly all the people who live in the Caucasus, and I don't even attempt to cover all the people who live in the Caucasus because there's a lot of different people who live there, large, small, and medium ethnic, national, religious, linguistic, and so on and so forth groups. Some of them I didn't cover intentionally because they have their roots a little bit in the Caucasus region. At least they have their roots a little bit later and have to do with later events in history. And in this particular series of podcasts, I wanted to talk primarily about the very early groups. The second disclaimer, again, is people, I understand that the geopolitical situation in the Caucasus is extremely volatile. It is extremely tender and kind of balanced with much difficulty on the pin of on a pin or on the tip of a needle. And I am not by any means whatsoever an expert on the Caucasian peoples. I'm not an expert on the Chechen Republic. I do not claim to be an expert, either historical, cultural, or otherwise. However, as somebody who has, as a child, experienced the hospitality of the Chechen people and the beauty of the Chechen nature, as somebody who is fascinated with the history of the very ancient and very interesting and culturally rich peoples, I feel that it is necessary to at least attempt to give the Western audience an idea of what the Chechen people are like, a little bit of their origin and culture, because I believe that this is a very interesting, very key ethnic group, territory, and culture in the Caucasus today, and in the center of much controversy in the world news. But we will not be talking about modern history. We will not be talking about modern days. As much as possible, I'm going to avoid those subjects. It's not because they didn't happen, it's because that's not the focus of this episode. So please don't take offense if I do not focus on certain modern events that are very raw in everybody's hearts and souls still today. So episode 51, we're talking about the Chechen Republic. Let me pull up some maps to show you guys where they are. And we're going to talk about the origin of the Chechen people, which in itself is going to be an interesting conversation because there's not a very big consensus amongst the scientists regarding the origin of the Chechen people. So what I will be presenting is going to be what I believe to be most likely or most reasonable. So let me show you where the Chechen Republic is now. Last time we talked about Dagestan, and Dagestan and Chechnya are neighbors. We're looking right now at the Chechen people, Chechen and Ingush people, because those peoples share a lot of their history. They share a lot of their language is 80% alike. Basically, a Chechen person speaking their native tongue can understand somebody speaking an Ingush native tongue without any need for translator quite easily. They're very close languages. Now, this region is very different okay, so I want to state this because this is kind of our wrap-up episode on Caucasus. A lot of the people of Caucasus share a lot of traits because they've lived side by side for their entire existence, especially the peoples who've lived there for a very long time, because they have mutually infiltrated, because they have shared cultures, they have shared languages, they have shared traditions, because they come a lot of times from the same environments or from the same origin. So there's a lot of commonality between all these people, but there's also a lot of difference in religion, difference in cultural tradition, difference in their ethnic self-image and their ethnic identification, difference in how they view their particular ethnicity or don't view it in some cases. Some of these groups are now states. Now, Chechnya and Ingushetia have separated. They've kind of shared a history for a very long time, but they differ quite a bit from the Dagestani people, which we talked about last time, in the sense that they are one ethnic commonality. Now, let me switch to another screen where I want to start telling you a little bit more about these people. The difference between the Ingush and the Chechen people right now is being highly debated between the Ingush and the Chechen people, also the Dagestani people and all the other surrounding people. Long, complex ethnic relationships and inter-ethnic. So there's extra-ethnic and intra-ethnic complex relationships. Very hot region. So I am not claiming anything is a complete and final truth. I'm maybe mistaken in some of the facts I'm offering. If that is the case, if somebody catches me on that, please correct me in your commentary. It is much appreciated, especially from those who know what they're talking about, with some background in the region. Now, for this episode, I'm sorry, a lot of disclaimers, very kind of sensitive topic. I have used a lot of different sources. I have used Russian sources. I have used Chechen sources. Quite a majority of my sources actually have been Chechen scientists, not Soviet Chechen scientists, but today modern Chechen scientists, and not just Chechen scientists in Chechnya, but also Chechen scientists abroad. So I just want to let everybody know that I've tried to get as broad and as close to origin and to the sources, I guess, buttery butter as possible. But some Soviet works, but I have tried to choose the Soviet works of much later Soviet period that are not as ideologically driven. And I'm going to try to avoid all ethnic conflict conversations if possible, with some exceptions. Now, the region of Chechnya, and in Ingush region, but Chechnya particularly, is a region that has been at war continuously since the civilization appeared on this earth, since the dawn of time. Some authors, some scientists trace them back to the Stone Age. Some trace them back to the Bronze Age and so forth. I am personally impartial to the supposition that the Chechen people were basically original local population that began somewhere in the Stone Age and then overlapped, but still at its core remained that very original, very archaic layer and substrate in it. You remember when we talked about the Hittite Empire, right? That built itself on the substrate of the Hatti people. So I'm going to show you some maps now. Of course, the distribution of these people is very highly debated. Some of these maps are American, some of these, English, some of them are in different other languages, some of them are Turkish. You can still kind of see what I'm talking about. So right here, we have the Katusha, the Hittite Empire, was the Hatti population. This is one of its possible borders during one time period. Here we have Subartu, which remember, Urartu, Subartu, kind of close, possibly the same, possibly not. Right here we have Hurri, that's the Hurrians or the Hurrites. It's really hard to find accurate maps of this region, and so you guys can basically see what you're looking at roughly, right? So right here we have the Hattusha, was the Hatti people, right? You see right here Hurri, Hurrites, Hurrians. Subartu, which again is potentially Urartu or related to Urartu. Mitanni, which is most likely was somehow related to the Hurrian peoples. Hurrian peoples in general used to live in this whole region quite a bit. As a matter of fact, as you remember from our conversation about the Mitanni, partially a Hurrian substrate. So the Hurrian people used to be spread all over this region. And right here, do you see Kasita? And I will go to a different map. So Kassites, Hurrians, Mitanni, Subartu, Hatti, all these people are people that were closely related to the modern Caucasus peoples. Those of them who are more archaic populations, they're related to the Adyghi, to the Abkhazians, they're related to the, we've talked about some of the Dagestani people, they're related to a lot of these actotonic groups. So Hurrian people, Hatti people. Let me go to the next map just so that we have an idea of what antiquity we're talking about. This is another map right here. There's again Urartu, Hurrians, Mitanni, which is very close to the Hurrian people. That's the ones that really matter to us right here. Is this region right here, right? So this Urartu Hurrian language group, the Chechen Ingush languages. So when I say Chechen from this point in time, I apologize to the Ingush people, but I'm referring linguistically, at least I'm referring to both groups. Their languages are most closely related. They believe to be is most closely related to those ones. And there's another map. Again, we have Kassites here. And once Mitanni fell, we remember that Hattusha, the Hittite people, had a lot to do with the collapse of the Mitanni kingdom. And that's when the Kassite, this is Kassite Babylonian, that's when Kassites ruled, but Kassites, Kashki, they lived in this region, and they were very warlike tribes that never were quite absorbed by the Hittite Empire. They continued raiding it and raiding it and raiding it, and did not exactly help it not fall when it finally collapsed. These were warriors, peoples who were never conquered by anyone, never absorbed by anyone. And so between the Kassites, Hatti, and the Hurri and Mitanni peoples, those are believed to be peoples who are the ancestors of modern Chechen and Ingush peoples. Just to give you an idea of how far into the past roots of some of these groups go. Now, again, this is just one theory. It's just by one Chechen author, scientist, esteemed researcher. But nonetheless, I thought this was a stark example. So today in the Chechen society is broken up into subgroups that are known as types. Now, don't confuse this with the English term types, like types, type of animal, type of, even though they're very similar, this is a word that is not related to, English language at all and comes from a different region. So once upon a time, the Hurrian peoples used to live in communities. They used to live in village or city, like large conglomerations of small villages, communities. So the Hurrians didn't really have a kingdom as such. They didn't have a king. They had communities that were a lot like polises in Greece. So think about, your Athens, so that's what types were like. They were communities that oftentimes were identified. They were conglomeration of small social groups that had their own courts, that had their own laws, that self-governed like policies did. And they oftentimes were labeled by their professional occupation. For example, you could have a type or types in Chechen, it's more often types. In Ingush, it's oftentimes tapes. They oftentimes, for example, you would have, type of smith, or type of sheep herders, or type of warriors for hire. But oftentimes they would be named by their professional inklings. Well, today in Chechen and Ingush societies, we have the same thing. We still have the same things. And all the way till beginning of the 20th century, until the Soviet Revolution, the Chechen society still functioned primarily, even though they would call in lords from other tribes or from other ethnic groups, for example, from the nearby Avars. Sometimes they would call in Avars, what's called knyaz. So knyaz is kind of like a lord, but it's bigger than a lord, and it's a lot like konung. So think of knyaz, because that term is going to come up when we're talking much later, when we're talking about ancient Rus. But they would call in rulers from the Avars for that period of time on agreement, basically saying, look, you're going to come in and you're going to be our ruler until this war is over. So you're going to organize, you're going to collect such and such taxes, but you don't have these rights, don't have those rights, don't have these rights, and then you're going to leave once we're done. So it's a contract ruler. Does that make sense? Mostly it seems to be kind of a polis type organization, self-governing. And today, to this day, I don't know how many types, for example, in Chechen Republic there are today, but I know that there are 9 main ones that, compose the body of the kind of ruling group. And the elders of the type are the ones to this day who solve most of the internal problems, who issue most of the laws, who direct whether it is socio-economical activity, cultural activity, or anything like that. Today, it's very tightly wrapped up with Islam. Now, Chechen Republic, Ingush Republic, they are both Muslim and have been Muslim for a very long time, very deeply Muslim peoples. That particular structure is something that allowed the Chechen society to be extremely flexible and extremely capable of. This is just to give you some ideas. I mean, nature of Chechen Republic. Then it's going to go into some of the ancient structures of the Chechen Republic. So there are certain similarities between the Chechen language, even structurally, and the as far back as the Sumerian language. But that is just one of the early suppositions. Today, most scientists do 100% believe that the Chechen English languages are closely linked to the Hurrian peoples, to the Hurrian society at least, and possibly that some of the earliest substrates of those peoples may have comprised of Hurrians, Kashki type related groups, as well as some early in the proto-Indo-European groups that may have overlapped. Now, these groups, this whole group of people, there's the Chechen people, there's the Ingush people, and then there's some other ethnicities that are not as numerous. Now, of Chechen people today, I believe there's 4 million total. And out of them, about 3 million live in the Chechen Republic, plus or minus. There's a large congregation, of Chechens who live in Turkey, for example. There's in France, in Germany, in Israel, all over the world. For English people, I believe there's about 700,000, and of them about 400,000 live, of course, in English Republic. Up until recently, those two group commonalities were one. They only split up within the last 2 centuries. As I have mentioned, this land has been at war since time immemorial. Just to name a few people who conquered this region, you had the Caucasian Albania kingdom. Before that, they may have not had something to do with Urartu, which of course would have had to do with Assyrians. Romans, Greeks, let's see, Khazars, Kipchaks, Hans, Goth, Mongolian, brutal Mongolian first wave. And just as soon as they managed to pull themselves together out of ruins, second, absolutely brutal, devastating, wiping them. Tamerlane, Tamerlane is what he's known as in Western discourse. By the way, the kingdom of Alans, of course, got wiped out completely by the Mongols, and there's much debate about how much the Alan people contributed to the foundation of Chechen peoples. These are peoples who have been constantly at war with their neighbors. They are peoples who, just in recent centuries, with Russian Empire, they've been at war since 18th century, 19th century, 20th century with Soviet Union on and off, and the last war just ended most recently in 2000. My grandma, that's Soviet Union, and then again, just Russian Federation. These are the peoples who have known the hardships of war and the hard brotherhood of war throughout their history very deeply within. It's a part of their cultural code. It's a part of their self-identification. My grandparents, a little bit about modern events. In 1944, there was the deportation of the entire Chechen population out of Chechnya. It was a horrible time for the entire Soviet Union, horrible time. It was a brutal experience. I'm sure a lot of you heard about the deportation of the Crimean Tatars or Tatarians. How do you say it in English? Tatars. At the same time, the deportation of the Ingush, Chechen, and some of the other surrounding people happened. The deportation of Chechnya was brutal. As a child, I have my mom gave me a children's book to read. It was called "And the Golden Cloud Gently Rested." And I'm just going to share this with you guys. It's a story of a little boy during Russian Soviet Union during World War II, who had a twin brother, and they were living in an orphanage in St. Petersburg. If I remember right. Bottom line is they were like little kids. They were like 7 or 8 years old, and the one brother was the smart one, and the other brother was one was the brains, the other one was the muscle, and it was hunger and horrific, just suffering, and they were like stealing bread on the streets. Bottom line is their entire orphanage got put on a train and sent off what they were promised to be the land of plenty of food. Long story short, they got sent to Chechnya, where the Chechen peoples have recently been deported from. Was there a couple of teachers, and they were of course shocked because there were fruit growing on the trees and there was plenty of food and it was warm, and they got settled in this resort that was completely abandoned. There was no people around. Well, all this joy and happiness lasted for about 2 days. About second day into their stay there, this children's, because it was mostly just little kids and a couple of teachers, like a lady and a guy with them, I think, an old, disabled man who was wounded in a war, missing a leg or something like that. Bottom line is they got attacked. I'm not going to go into the details of what happened, but when the main character, the younger of the two twin brothers, came to, he realized that everybody was missing. He didn't know where everybody wasn't, so he started looking for his brother. First he found his teacher's body. This is a children's book, guys. Just keep this in mind. Intended for children 7 to 14 years old. First he found the teacher's body. All their belongings thrown all around, and he was walking through these cornfields, and at one point in time he saw riders coming through, and hid in the really tall cornfields, and then he finally came across this empty village, and on the gates of the village was his brother crucified with corn stuffed down his throat and up into his open belly. And so about half of the book, he's taking his brother off the fence, and he is making kind of like a sled, and he's dragging him on foot across the entire country back to the train station that they came from, and laying him down into a train, into the cargo part of the train to send him back where they came from. So he would, he's so careful not to make sure that the sled doesn't shake, so his brother doesn't feel the pain. And after that, he meanders off somewhere, climbs into a cave, and he's running a fever. He's really sick, and he just kind of loses consciousness. Bottom line is, when he wakes up, there's a little Chechen boy about his age. Now, the main character, he's a blonde Russian kid. He's like totally blonde, blue-eyed, blonde haired. There's a little Chechen boy there who's taking care of him. He's sick, and this little Chechen boy's taking care of him. They don't speak each other's language. And when he comes to, because he's still delirious, he starts calling him his brother's name. He starts calling him Ivan. And so eventually, so it turns out that this little Chechen boy was just left behind during the deportation, also an orphan whose parents have been either killed or deported, and they cling to each other for the rest of their life. They cling each other, and to the point when the Soviet authorities finally come to the region and they find these two little kids, they try to separate them, but the little Russian boy, refuses to let go of his twin brother. He keeps screaming, "This is my twin brother, this is my twin brother, Ivan." And because of that, they never separated. They're sent back to wherever, Central Russia together, and they wind up growing up as twin brothers for the rest of their life. And this was actually not a biographical story that it made a really strong impact on me as a kid. Bottom line is, it was a brutal, complex, convoluted time where a lot of people suffered needlessly on all sides. The Chechen people suffered horribly, and what is more pertinent to our historical discussion here is the fact that a lot of the historical artifacts, books, writings, scrolls, cultural artifacts of all kinds, gold, weapons, carpets, you name it, archaeological sites, was destroyed. Now, in 1950s, the Chechen people were allowed to return back to their land, but that time period, and then the following two Chechen wars that happened in 1990s and ended in 2000, have left the Republic in complete shambles. And so a lot of cultural heritage and historical information has been downright misplaced. It's still being gathered from museums all over the world, museums, in Armenia, in Georgia, in Russia, in foreign countries. A lot of their heritage, they just are trying to piece back together. These are the people who are very keen on their history. These are people who respect and honor their elders.
All right, just about. They were, of course, in the middle of a war going on there in 1944. There were like five or six peoples, I think, and this was horrible because they did kind of erase a culture, or tried to. They suffered some when they went to some of the places they were, mostly in Central Asia. I believe it was under Khrushchev that they. I'm not getting into politics. But I mean, you should recognize tragedy whoever it's by, So we can be pretty awful to each other. That they have been able to build their population back to 4 million people is a tribute to their toughness.
This leads to a very different discussion, and kind of a parallel discussion, and that is, if you will, how cultures embrace trauma and how they deal with trauma. And you're speaking of peoples and culture that, as you say, has been at war. Since the beginning of time, and it's, and it leads to a discussion, a parallel discussion of what does peace look like? What does living in peace look like?
That's
And
about to talk about next a little bit.
yeah, and it's, what does it take? What does it take? And not just at a cultural level, but also at a physiological level. What does it take to deal with trauma?
Very good. That's a very good question. I'm going to run again in the background some images and answer your question a little bit. But first, we're going to talk a little bit more about war, though not modern war, but ancient war. So we talked about the towers in Caucasus and the tower settlements in Caucasus. Now, the tower settlements in Chechen Republic, and particularly in the Ingush Republic, are prevalent. A lot of them, and when I say a lot of them, I mean majority of them have been wiped out and destroyed, but these are very ancient structures. Some of them are what's called castles. Now, when we're talking about castle, we're not talking about the European style castle. This is particularly a castle, one of the few last surviving castle complexes that are very hard to find images of. Trying to get to but when you talk about castle, what you're talking about is a conglomeration of individual towers. Now, there's three types of towers that are described by people who study them. There is a living tower. We've talked about those a couple times in the Nartic epic stories, where you have, it's mostly like living quarters, but they also have the defensive capacity. So they have the animals on the bottom, then usually they build with one side up into the mountain, so where they can dig out a kind of a cellar where they keep their foods cold and stuff like that. But if enemy approaches, they can get up towards the top and they can barricade themselves in there and defend themselves from the top. Then you have the defensive or the military towers, which are exclusively designed for defensive purposes, and they are, in case of a serious attack with serious danger, then all the peoples of a settlement run into those military towers. They can be anywhere from 3 to 7 stories tall, and they're much more, and then nobody lives in them on a permanent basis. And then there's the half defensive or half living towers, which are kind of a mixture between the two. So a settlement is usually made out of, one of these tower cities, or whatever you want to call them, is made out of a couple of defensive towers in the center. And then you have, surrounded by half defensive towers, then you have the outer circle of the living towers. And then on the outskirts, you have the watchtowers. And that's a castle. That's one of those things. It's basically a castle, like an arrangement like that. Not a lot of those survive today, but each individual taite or tepe or whatever, however you want to call it, each one of these polises originally had one of these, at least one of these, at its heart, at its center, one of these defensive bastions. Ingush Republic, Chechen Republic, they are known for their towers. Other forms of, so this is something that goes way back. Another interesting thing about these towers is on some of the more archaic of them, and this is of course not very ancient times, but it's 11th century to 14th century mostly. They have petroglyphic writings on the stones and the towers themselves. So the stones and the towers, the arches and so forth, will have petroglyphic signs on them, which is scientists believe is a proto form of writing. But the city of Grozny, which my grandparents used to have a home in, which I watched bombed on national television, my grandparents managed to get out of there right before the attack happened, right before the first Chechen war. They managed to bail from there on one of the last departing trains, but it has been bombed into smithereens, and since 2000, it has been restored to where now it is showcase city of Caucasus and of Russia. Really, I mean, enormous amounts of funding has been sent into restoring villages, restoring homes, restoring cities, restoring infrastructure. A lot of efforts have been put forth to try to restore, at the very least, the material aspects of the land. But these petroglyphic signs, scientists are still studying them, and they believe it was a proto form of writing that did not quite evolve to full-scale writing, but it would mark the stones that were most decorative places of the towers. And they're trying to understand and learn what these signs meant. There are scientists who are working on trying to kind of accumulate the meanings and the interpretations of these. The thing is, these stones were very precious. It is documented that, for example, for some of these just stones that you use to build a tower, brick, basically stone brick, people would pay as much as a whole bull, like a cow, for one brick. So of course, when that structure would collapse or grow decrepit, they would regather those stones and they would reuse them. So some of these petroglyphs may be a lot older than we think, because this kind of recycling of material is something that's been going on for centuries in that region. Chechnya also in particular has been a very forested area. Up until recently, it was very thickly forested mountains. And just like Dagestan being a little bit, just like Dagestan is separated, but the mountains in Chechnya are a little bit more conducive, a little bit less severe, I suppose. I mean, I remember there being just fields and rivers, you know, singing mountain rivers and boulders and clear water and just plenitude of wildlife. As you can see, it's beautiful, beautiful, just beautiful views. I mean, Chechnya is absolutely gorgeous place. And to where like in some parts of Caucasus, the mountains are right here, you're right in the mountains. In Chechnya, oftentimes mountains are a little bit off to the side, kind of like they are in Colorado. They're a little bit off to the side. They're not right in your face, but they're close enough to where people can retreat there in case of danger or in case of an attack. And throughout their history, people of that region have used that very well to defend themselves. Russian Empire, just to give you an idea, in the 18th and 19th century, suffered enormous losses over and over and over and again, and to where organized armies time and time and time again would come against these defenders, and they would be beaten. Now, an interesting characterization of the Chechens. What?
Can I make a quick observation?
Of course. Just don't let me lose my train. So okay, let me
Go
start.
ahead.
I just was going to say that and then David is going to jump in, but an interesting observation of the Chechen people made by one Russian general during the 19th century, I believe during the Caucasian Wars. I've mentioned before that a lot of the people of Caucasus have the wolf as their totem animal, is their symbol animal. And this general in particular has said that out of all the peoples that he has met, the people of Chechnya, the warriors of Chechnya, are most akin to a wolf, in the sense that a wolf is a very daring, fearless, and very brave, very courageous animal. And it's one of the few predators that will not hesitate to attack a prey that is larger than itself. And by the same token, when a Chechen warrior, this I'm quoting again a Russian general during the Caucasus War, is in a situation where he's going to die, when he's facing death, just like a wolf, he will die without complaint or a sound and just face his end nobly and stoically. And such are the warriors of the Chechen people, that they're very stoic, very courageous, and very daring peoples.
I just wanted to note, just on those pictures, there's a uncanny kind of resemblance to early Roman. They were more like post towers, and that's where the word castle comes from. I think is the castorum, if I remember right. But they look just like, just the drawings. They always seem like they were too compacted and stuff, but they look just like those. And I don't know that Rome ever got that far over, but they were.
Not that early. No.
I don't think they ever did, but it's very much like it. And these were structures that were on the limes or the Roman frontiers, and I don't know. I just thought it was something interesting.
Some of these petroglyphs look very interesting. They're very different, solar symbols and stuff like that. These are just different petroglyphs from different. I'm trying to get back to that picture. Yeah. I mean, just images like this. And as we know, petroglyph is very similar to hieroglyph in the sense that it packs a lot of meaning into a symbol. But these symbols, that's what I mean about the petroglyphs. And they're pretty sure that these had some sort of this, but a lot of very archaic looking to us, archaic looking images. And to what David said, I think that's more of a convergent evolution sort of thing, in the sense that similar needs lead to similar structure and similar shapes. I think that's probably
Persian or in Romania.
Yeah, well, and I don't know what the environment was in the location you're thinking about, but I mean, if they have had kind of a shortage of construction material and mountainous terrain, it makes sense that similar architecture would make sense.
A lot of sun images and different ways of drawing the sun. That's interesting. Like maybe half of those pictures are actually the sun.
Right, there a lot of them are solar or astrological symbolism. A lot of them are. They're still trying, and as you can see, swastika is not something that's exclusively Nazi, and it's been some appropriated marches. But yeah, a lot of these are solar symbols, as Chris said, absolutely. Now you asked me about the peaceful life and the way that societies work, Nathan. So there are no cuss words in the Chechen language. There's no swear words at all in Chechen and Ingush language. So if they want to swear, they wind up in modern day cities, and when they're living away from their land, they will be swearing in Russian or some other language. The most cussing expression, from what I understand in Chechen language, you can have is something like "May you carry your relatives on your back," because
They'll just kill you. That because lots of war going on here, but no swearing. Interesting.
Because in societies that are smaller and more traditional, words have a lot of weight. They have a lot of weight. People think before they speak. Everybody carries themselves with dignity. It's kind of like on the frontier, you don't want to walk in and insult the cowboy because that cowboy might have a bigger gun than you. That sort of concept idea. So everybody's really respectful to each other. When even today, when you're in company of Chechen youth, for example, amongst themselves, not off somewhere on vacation, but like among themselves, every word they always address each other respectfully, like such ideas, picking on each other, or like little jokes that American guys, for example, really like this guy humor when you kind of poke at each other and peck at each other. That's not done in these societies at all. The idea of and there's a good reason for. Also, the idea of seniority is very important. Like the older people because for the longest time these societies were very traditional, right? And only in the modern couple of centuries that we come to a situation where the knowledge of our elders may not be as relevant to us today, because technology and everything else keeps changing. But back then, for centuries, when the traditions of weaponry and war, when the traditions of how you work the land, of how you take care of your horses or take care of your other animals, how you build houses, it all remained the same. So the elders were very, very key members of the society, because they carried all that knowledge that the youth could learn from, and that very much remains still in those regions. So the fathers are respected greatly. The mothers are respected enormously. And to insult somebody's mother is just unthinkable to even a sister, or to insult anybody's older, parents or anybody else is just out of question, This is an ethnographic expedition. I'm going to skip through that. This is a little bit about tradition and culture. I kind of did a conglomeration of women, the role of the women in the society. Of course, this is a Muslim society, so the females are very conservative. They're very respectable. They are, on the one hand, sheltered and protected, but they're also highly esteemed. They're women who are, they're mythological and historical tales of women being able to stop a war between neighboring villages because basically a woman walking in the middle of a battlefield and saying stop again, like we heard in some other more ancient cultures, is very effective means of stopping the man.
A lot of very good looking people amongst them.
They're known for their beauty. Red-headed, light-haired, mixed, all kinds of hair color and everything else. They're very, very attractive women, very attractive men. Interesting detail, there was a sociological study in the Ingush, in the whole Caucasus region, where sociologists were trying to establish how a person self-identified among, for example, different groups like Chechens, Ingush, some other people. And so among Chechens, self-identification generally went first Chechen, second Muslim, and then anything else like, citizen of Russia, romantic artist, warrior, whatever. In the Ingush people, most of them identified first as Muslim, second as Ingush. But bottom line is their national self-identification, their ethnic self-identification, and their religious self-identification is very key to their history. It's a religion they bled for, fought for, defended for many, many centuries. Islam has been with them for a very long time. And their traditional Islam is not exactly the same as some of the militant Islam we see today. That form of Islam was introduced there in the 90s, and modern day Chechen authorities are very eager to bring back the traditional Islam, which is a lot more organic to the peoples who live there. But people of great beauty, like you said, people of very much respect, grace, honor, and hospitality, again, hospitality, endless amounts of hospitality. That's pretty much all I wanted to say today about the people of Chechnya.
A question. I know the hospitality is built into the Islam faith. I mean, Arabs are also very hospitable, but were the people like that before they were Muslim? Or
they were. I think anytime you have difficult living conditions, whether it's cold, extreme heat, extreme scarceness of food, extreme mountainous terrain, extreme danger of enemies attacking, hospitality, I think, is a way of neutralizing those, mitigating those dangers, a way of, on the one hand, permitting others to survive, so that through reciprocity you can survive if you're in those circumstances, and at the same time establishing those ties with neighbors and potential allies. In other ways, it's a way of neutralizing conflict and facilitating mutual survival. I think that's probably where that comes from. And that's where the Arabs got theirs as well, because again, we have extremely harsh living conditions, and therefore that's the Islam gets it from the Arabs with their desert dwelling originally.
Yeah, it's important to ensure mutual survival, because what's good for your neighbor is good for you, typically.
Right.
And I actually have a quick question.
Sure.
What about their cuisine? What type of food?
Oh my gosh, I have been dying for some Caucasian food, Turkish. If you can find a real, and I mean a real Turkish restaurant ran by Turks and cooking Turkish recipes, not American wannabe shawarma or whatever it's called, real Turkish stuff. Take a chance and eat it, please, because Caucasian food in general, I mean, every kitchen has every nationality has slightly different kitchen, but their tables, man, their food, the sauces, the meat, yeah. I mean, I've been literally like shaking wanting some Caucasian food as of late. I found kind of a semi-Turkish restaurant around here that's they have a lot of greens, a lot of just yum. Yeah, in a lot of Caucasian peoples, it's the man who does the cooking. The woman is not allowed near the meat or the kitchen. It's a man's duty. Yeah, I mean, amazing, yummy, very good. Yeah, when the corn got introduced to the Caucasus, it made a whole big difference in the tradition, because with corn, I mean, corn has become so integral to their kitchen nowadays that I don't think they can, just like potatoes in Russia or Ireland, it's one of those things that they no longer can even imagine themselves without.
Well, if nothing else, I always like to try new ideas and new styles. I've been very interested in European cuisine, like from Poland and other countries. I'd never understood, how to cook things properly until I looked at recipes that people provide on the internet that actually grew up in these other countries.
And the thing is, even with those recipes, you oftentimes won't get a good idea of what, this is, you won't get a very good idea, because sometimes, like a lot of the cooking, it comes with observing your mother, observing your grandmother, how she mixes the dough, I'm saying, how she breaks up the little pieces of things, how you chop up the salad. I mean, those things are very essential. Let me see. Okay, this one is not. Oh, go away. I don't want to experience interruptions. Okay, it's not gonna, okay. So this is some ladies cooking. I mean, the breads, greens, lots of onions, lots of parsley, lots of cornbreads and corn type, I don't know what you would call them, a lot of spicy sauces, really well made meat. I mean, Caucasian kitchen, lots of eggs, lots of meat, lots of meat. I mean,
do they eat a lot of horse there?
A lot of what?
Horse.
No, they don't. They eat a lot of sheep, matches and lots of.
A horse would be probably pretty rare.
No, they don't eat horse at all. That's not a question.
Because just any horses you had there were probably very high status things. I just wanted to touch on the honor system in all the Caucasus and the hospitality, these were warrior cultures. And taking such great care with language, we could probably learn from that, because the reason that got that way was when somebody didn't take care, it ended up somebody dying. And these were small mountain communities, and then you could have blood feuds and lots
Yeah,
of,
black youths.
and
Much
that,
loss.
and so you learn to listen to your elders. You learn to not spout your mouth off. Like I say, we could probably use some of that too.
Yes, I agree with David. And also, are the cooking responsibilities split between genders? Like the men handle the grilling of the meat and the cooking of the meat.
Yeah,
Women handle.
generally speaking, yeah.
baking the bread.
There's definitely a man's job. Yeah.
Especially for
But the women often handle perhaps the baking of the bread, or are they divided?
I think in modern families it's very ambiguous. But I mean, even though today traditionally it's still a lot of it is still traditional. But I mean, today a lot more is allowed, a lot more variability is permitted. But generally speaking, in my experience, what I have observed, I don't claim to be an expert on the subject, but from what I have observed, you generally speaking, the meat is definitely a man's undertaking, and the everything. I mean, like I'm looking right here at the video of a gentleman and his little girl making meat together. So today it's become a lot more cosmopolitan, you know what I mean, cosmopolitan. But yeah, definitely. I just miss it. It's yummy. It's sad that I'm looking at this and I'm sad. I'm just much sad. I'm looking at this menu right here. I'm going to show this to you guys.
Maybe I shouldn't have brought it up.
No, it's okay, because that's something that I haven't covered, and I probably should have, because the food of the Caucasus is, it's somewhat close to Turkish cuisine, but no, not really. Anyway, that's that. But I'm going to stop holding people up. I know Chris has to be going, and that's pretty much all I really wanted to say at this point in time. I'm just a very kind of general glimpse at the peoples and at the people of Caucasus. And again, all these people have a lot in common. They have lots of differences between them. They're all unique. A lot of them are very ancient people with their unique speech, their unique culture, their unique self-identity. And they're people who have come and persevered from the very darkest depth of time that we could not even begin to imagine, was our very newborn, a country that is only a couple hundred years old. I mean, these are cultures that have lasted centuries and millennia. And we should probably all respect one another, because each and every culture, each and every language, each and every ethnicity is unique and precious. And that knowledge, their genetics, their language and their grammar, their traditions, their legends, all of our legends really is what makes up humanity as a whole, and allows scientists to study and learn more and more about peoples in general. So that's pretty much what I want to call everybody to, is, make science, not war. So yeah.
Well, I appreciate, and I really appreciate what Ryan mentioned regarding the food. Mm-hmm. And I'm very also food oriented, and so maybe just literally food for thought for the group moving forward. As we talk about these cultures, let's talk about, and maybe we can also come back and revisit some cultures that we've talked about, and also moving forward, other cultures. Let's incorporate some food elements, and let's all respectively do some research. Maybe post some recipes.
Recipe, Greek recipe, real quick.
Let's play with this.
Plain bread, flatbread, garlic.
In any case, I think that might be a little bit of a fruitful approach, Nathan, because cuisine and food in general is something that sometimes people forget, and it's actually one of the most integral parts of a culture, because everybody has to eat.
And we're dealing with the time period of roughly when the hunter-gatherers were taking over from farming, or farmers were taking over rather. So it's looking at food is actually, because food changed at that time.
Absolutely. You know what? I'm going to leave it in your guys' capable hands as foodies. I'm not a foodie at all. So those of you who are a little bit more taste inclined.
230 pounds here, so yeah.
Sounds like a plan. Okay, guys. David is jumping on real quick.
Just to point out that many of those crops that show up now as traditional foods, like millet, but what is now not the corn is obviously a new world crop. Potatoes were a new world crop. Kind of went more animal the other way because New World didn't have much in the way of animals that for domesticating. Yeah, I think it's a great idea to try to explore some of those things because it is an essential part of culture. The difference between butter in the north and olive oil in the south, you know.
I'll try to come up with something myself. That was a great podcast. Great to see everybody.
So good to see everyone. Thanks for joining us, guys. It's awesome to see everybody. Take care. Bye.
That exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.